Welcome to Lesson 2. We will continue to our journey in Domain 1. We will look into generally accepted privacy principles in this lesson. Having laid the groundwork on the importance of privacy protection, let's delve into the specific objectives of a privacy program. These goals delineate the essential steps required to safeguard personal information effectively. The generally accepted privacy principles, GAP, serve as a global framework for privacy management, developed collaboratively by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. These principles establish a common foundation for privacy practices. The 10 GAP principles. The GAP framework comprises 10 core principles, each addressing key aspects of privacy management: notice, choice and consent, collection, use, retention, and disposal, access, disclosure to third parties, security for privacy, quality, monitoring and enforcement. Exploring each principle. The subsequent sections of this exploration will delve into each GAP principle in detail, elucidating its significance and practical implications. By understanding and implementing these principles, organizations can establish robust privacy programs aligned with global best practices. Management. The management principle, the first among the 10 privacy principles outlined in GAP, lays the groundwork for effective privacy governance within organizations. According to GAP, management entails defining, documenting, communicating, and assigning accountability for privacy policies and procedures. Key criteria under this principle include creating written privacy policies and communicating them to personnel, designating responsibility and accountability for policy oversight, ensuring policies align with legal requirements and undergo regular review, conducting privacy risk assessments and integrating privacy considerations into technology implementation, establishing incident management protocols and providing ongoing privacy training. Notice. The notice principle, the second cornerstone of GAP, emphasizes transparency in privacy practices. Organizations are required to inform individuals about their privacy policies, including the purposes for collecting, using, retaining, and disclosing personal information. Key elements of notice include incorporating notice practices into privacy policies, clearly stating the purpose of data collection, and outlining policies aligned with GAP principles, providing notice to individuals at the point of data collection, during policy changes, and when using information for new purposes, ensuring privacy notices are written in simple language and prominently displayed for easy access. Choice and consent is the third principle of GAP, enabling individuals to maintain control over their personal information. GAP defines choice and consent as the entity describes the choices available to the individual and obtains implicit or explicit consent with respect to the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. Criteria associated with choice and consent, including choice and consent practices in the organization's privacy policies, informing individuals about available choice and consent options, including consequences of refusal or withdrawal, obtaining implicit or explicit consent at or before personal information collection, notifying individuals of proposed new uses for previously collected information, and obtaining additional consent. Directly obtaining explicit consent for sensitive personal information collection, use, or disclosure, obtaining consent before transferring personal information to or from an individual's computer or device. The principle of collection governs how organizations acquire personal information. GAP defines collection as the entity collects personal information only for the purposes identified in the notice. Criteria associated with collection, inclusion of collection practices in the organization's privacy policies, informing individuals that their personal information will only be collected for identified purposes, detailing methods and types of data collected in the organization's privacy notice, ensuring collection is conducted using fair and lawful means, aligned with identified purposes, verifying third-party sources' compliance with fair and lawful data collection practices, ensuring reliability, notifying individuals if additional information about them is obtained by the organization. Use, retention, and disposal principle ensures the privacy of personal information throughout its life cycle. GAP defines this principle as the entity limits the use of personal information to the purposes identified in the notice, and for which the individual has provided implicit or explicit consent. The entity retains personal information for only as long as necessary to fulfill the stated purposes, or as required by law or regulations, and thereafter appropriately disposes of such information. Criteria associated with use, retention, and disposal. Inclusion of practices in the organization's privacy policies, informing individuals that their personal information will only be used for disclosed purposes with obtained consent, and adhering to this statement. Informing individuals that data will be retained for no longer than necessary, and adhering to this statement. Informing individuals that information no longer needed will be securely disposed of, and adhering to this statement. Access is a fundamental aspect of individual privacy, granting individuals the right to access and, if necessary, correct information held by organizations. CIPM defines the access principle as the entity provides individuals with access to their personal information for review and update. Criteria associated with access. Inclusion of access practices in the organization's privacy policies. Informing individuals about procedures for reviewing, updating, and correcting their personal information. Providing individuals with a mechanism to determine whether the organization maintains personal information about them. Authenticating an individual's identity before granting access to personal information. Providing access to information in an understandable format within a reasonable period, either at a reasonable charge or free of cost. Informing individuals in writing about reasons for denying access or update requests, along with any appeal rights. Offering a mechanism for individuals to update or correct personal information, and ensuring such updates are shared with relevant third parties. Disclosure to third parties. Privacy challenges arise when organizations share personal information with third parties during business operations. CIPM defines the disclosure to third parties principle as the entity discloses personal information to third parties only for the purposes identified in the notice, and with the implicit or explicit consent of the individual. Criteria associated with disclosure to third parties. Inclusion of third-party disclosure practices in the organization's privacy policies. Informing individuals of any third-party disclosures and their purposes. Ensuring third parties receiving personal information comply with the organization's privacy policies. Disclosing personal information to third parties only when required by law or under agreements ensuring privacy protection. Implementing procedures to verify third parties' privacy controls' effectiveness. Taking remedial action if third parties mishandle shared personal information. Security for privacy. Protecting personal information security is crucial for safeguarding privacy. CIPM defines security for privacy as the entity protects personal information against unauthorized access, both physical and logical. Criteria associated with security for privacy. Inclusion of security practices in the organization's privacy policies. Informing individuals about privacy protection measures. Development, documentation, and implementation of an information security program covering major privacy-related areas. Restricting logical and physical access to personal information. Protecting personal information from environmental hazards and accidental disclosure. Applying strong encryption to transmit personal information. Minimizing storage of personal information on portable media, and using encryption when necessary. Conducting periodic tests of security safeguards. Quality. Quality is ensuring the accuracy of personal information is vital for privacy protection. The CIPM quality principle emphasizes maintaining accurate, complete, and relevant personal information. Quality principle enforces data integrity and reliability. Criteria associated with quality. Inclusion of data quality practices in the organization's privacy policies. Informing individuals of their responsibility to provide accurate and complete personal information, and to notify the organization of any necessary corrections. Maintenance of personal information that is accurate, complete, and relevant for intended purposes. Lastly, monitoring and enforcement. Privacy programs require continuous monitoring and enforcement to ensure ongoing effectiveness. The CIPM monitoring and enforcement principle emphasizes the need for ongoing compliance oversight. Criteria associated with monitoring and enforcement. Inclusion of monitoring and enforcement practices in the organization's privacy policies. Informing individuals about how to contact the organization regarding privacy-related inquiries, complaints, or disputes. Maintenance of a dispute resolution process to address complaints and provide documented responses. Annual review of compliance with privacy policies, laws, regulations, and contractual obligations. Development and implementation of remediation plans for identified privacy compliance issues. Documentation of privacy policy violations, and implementation of corrective actions. Ongoing monitoring of the privacy program based on risk assessment.